Alma Rourke, 74, drove her rusted-out '62 Ford up to the Delrose County building in a coat 2 winters past mending. The morning was cool. The truck coughed twice before it settled. She found a striped parking space near the steps and eased the Ford into it, slow, the way you park a thing you've owned a long time. A young man in a hard hat came over. A surveyor. He waved his clipboard at her like she was a stray dog wandered onto a job site. "This space is spoken for, ma'am." Reserved, he tapped the paint with his boot. She didn't say a word. She just moved the truck, backed it out, rolled it down the block, parked it where the pavement went bad and nobody wanted to be. Then she walked back up the hill, one hand on the rail, her mended coat pulled close. On the steps stood Gordon Prewitt, developer, big shoulders, big watch, a smile he used like a tool. 11 men in hard hats stood around him, and when he saw the old woman coming, he laughed, loud enough for all of them. "Lady, I've offered you 3 times what that weed lot is worth. Sign, or the county takes it for free." The men chuckled because he did. That quarter-acre was the last thing standing between Gordon Prewitt and a 12-mile expressway. One old woman, one patch of ground, and he wanted the whole room to know how small that was to him. But over in the doorway, half in shadow, the county recorder was watching. Hutchins, a quiet man with ink on his fingers. And when Alma passed him, he did a strange thing. He took off his hat to her. Slow, the way a man does at a graveside. There was one thing Gordon Prewitt never thought to look up. It was sitting in the deed room, 40 feet behind him, in a metal drawer that hadn't been opened in years. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me a small favor. Subscribe so stories like this one find you. And in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Alma's story travels. Then come back, and let's begin. Now, let me tell you how a poor old widow in a mended coat came to hold the whole of Gordon Prewitt's life in one steady hand. And how he never once thought to ask. It was spring of 1972, in Delrose County, Ohio farm country. Flat green fields cut through with gravel roads, and a little town called Harlan Springs sitting in the middle of it, dozing in the sun. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, or thought they did. Alma Rourke lived 4 miles out, on the home place. A white farmhouse gone gray at the corners. A porch her husband built. A barn that leaned a little now, and a stand of tomato plants she tended every morning like they were company. Her husband was Silas Rourke. He'd been gone 3 years. And in all the years the town had watched the two of them, nobody had ever seen a thing worth talking about. They drove old trucks. They wore old clothes. Silas fixed his own fences. Alma canned her own beans. They went to church, sat in the back, gave their little envelope, and went home. Plain people. That's what folks said. Good, plain, poor people. That's what folks said. But here is what the town never bothered to learn. For 40 years, Silas and Alma Rourke had been buying land. Not the good land, not the land anybody wanted. They bought the tax lien farms, the ones where the family had failed and the county was owed. They bought a drained bog nobody could plant. They bought town lots that bankrupt men had walked away from, keys left in the door. Little pieces, cheap pieces. Pieces that came up for nothing, because nobody else would touch them. And they never bought a one of them in their own name. Every deed, every lot, every acre went down on paper under a plain little company, Coldwater Land and Title Company. A name so gray and dull that a clerk could file it and forget it in the same minute. That was the point. Silas used to say that a name should be like a fence post. You shouldn't notice it. It should just hold the wire. They never spent what they made. Never bragged. Never built themselves a big house or bought a new car to sit in the drive. The money went back into more land. More gray, forgotten paper. Year after year, quiet as grass growing. And when Silas died, it all came to Alma. All of it. She knew exactly what she held. She just didn't feel any need to say so. The one parcel she still lived on, the home place, the White House and the porch and the tomatoes, sat right in the middle of everything, that quarter-acre of yard and the fields around it. And it happened, by an accident of geography, to be the exact footprint where the state wanted to run its new interchange, the knot where the expressway would cross the county road, right through Alma Rourke's front porch. She didn't know that at first. She found out the way most people find out about trouble. It came up her driveway. Two men in a clean sedan. One of them was Prewitt's. The other carried a leather folder. They knocked on her door, and they smiled the smile men use on the old, and they laid a paper on her kitchen table. $3,850. For the quarter-acre. For the house Silas built, and the porch, and the whole home place. Generous, the folder man said. Real generous for a lady your age. You could move into town. Something small. Something easy to keep. Alma looked at the paper a long moment. Then she looked at the two men. She didn't get angry. She'd been on this earth too long to spend anger on strangers. She just said, "No thank you. This is my home. My husband built it. I mean to die on that porch. And I'm in no hurry to be moved along." The folder man's smile got a little thinner. He said she should think it over. He said the county had ways of taking land it needed, and a person did better to sell than to be taken. He said Mr. Prewitt didn't like to be told no. Alma walked them to the door. She thanked them for coming. She watched the clean sedan back down her drive and turn onto the gravel and disappear in its own dust. Then she got in her old Ford and drove into Harlan Springs to the county building to see Del Hutchins. Now I want you to watch this part close, because this is where a thing got planted, and neither the town nor Gordon Prewitt caught it. Alma went to the recorder's counter and told Del she wanted her refusal of the offer put on the record. Official, dated, she signed it in her small, careful hand. And Del took the paper, and he didn't file it in with the ordinary business of the day. He walked it back to a certain drawer, and he laid it in, and he said, "Easy as anything. I'll put this with the rest of Coldwater's papers, Mrs. Rourke with the rest of Coldwater's papers." He said it like it was nothing, like he was telling her the weather. And Alma nodded like it was nothing too. Because to the two of them, it was nothing. It was just the truth, sitting where it always sat. If anybody had been standing at that counter, and if they'd had ears to hear, they might have wondered. What rest of Coldwater's papers? Why would a poor widow have papers at all, let alone a drawer of them? But nobody was standing there, and nobody wondered. The words went out into the air and fell to the floor and were swept up with the dust. Alma drove home. She watered her tomatoes. She thought no more about it than she'd think about locking her own door. She wasn't scheming. Understand that about her. She wasn't laying a trap. She just wanted her porch, and she'd said so, and now it was written down. That was all. But Gordon Prewitt was not a man who took a no and let it lie. A week later, she learned what the folder man had promised. Prewitt filed a petition. Eminent domain. It's the law that lets the government take a man's land for a public purpose, so long as it pays him what the land is worth. A road counts as a public purpose, and Prewitt, though he was a private man building for private money, had gotten the county to carry his water. The petition asked the county to condemn the Rourke parcel and hand it over so the expressway could go through. The county set a hearing, a condemnation hearing, 31 days out. And here is the thing about that date that nobody in the room but two people understood. 31 days out was the very same day that Gordon Prewitt's highway bond came due. The money he'd borrowed to build the whole expressway. The clock on the land and the clock on the debt were set to strike at the very same hour. He had to have the ground by then, or the bond would eat him alive. He'd bet everything on the 2 clocks ringing together in his favor. Alma got the notice in the mail. She read it at the kitchen table with her glasses down on her nose. 31 days. She folded it back into its envelope. Then she got in the Ford and drove to town again, because she wanted to see the filing with her own eyes, the way Silas had taught her. Always look at the paper yourself. Never take a man's word for what a paper says. She was leaving the county building when it happened. Del Hutchins was at the door, and as she came through, he took off his hat again. Same as before. Held it against his chest and gave her a small nod, grave and respectful, like she was somebody. One of Prewitt's hardhats was leaning by the door, waiting on business of his own. He saw the recorder tip his hat to the shabby old woman in the mended coat, and he laughed a little, and he asked, "What's that about, Del? She the Queen of England?" Del Hutchins put his hat back on. He looked at the young man a moment, and all he said was, "You'd be surprised." Then he went back inside, and the door swung shut, and the hardhat stood there frowning, not sure what he'd just seen. You'd be surprised. Hold on to that. Because the whole town was about to be. The hearing was still weeks off when Prewitt made his mistake. His big one. The one that the whole rest of this story turns on. The county commission held a meeting. Open to the public. Folding chairs in the old assembly room, the commissioners up on their little platform, a water pitcher sweating on the table. It was meant to be a small thing. Some road business. Some permits. And the matter of the interchange, which everybody already thought was settled, because who was going to stand against a highway and jobs and progress? One old widow? Please, Prewitt came to that meeting, sure of himself. He came the way a man comes to collect something he's already counted as his. And Alma came too, because it was her home they were talking about, and she wasn't the sort to hide in her house while men decided her fate in a room she could walk to. She sat near the front in her patched coat, hands folded in her lap. Small, quiet, and when the interchange came up on the agenda, Gordon Prewitt stood, and he turned so the whole room could see him, and he decided to have some fun. He talked about progress. He talked about the 12 miles of expressway and the trucks it would carry and the money it would bring to Harlan Springs. And then he pointed. He pointed right at the little old woman in the front row. And there, he said, there sits the one thing standing in the way of all of it. He waved a hand at her coat, the mended coat, the collar gone soft with age. Look at her, folks, one stubborn woman in a quarter-acre of weeds, holding up the future of this whole county. He shook his head like it grieved him. She's the last stubborn weed in the road of progress. And I aim to pull her. Beside him, a young man laughed. Carl Meach, Prewitt's junior assistant, a slick kid with his boss's manners and none of his years. He snickered at the weed line, and he leaned over and said something to the man next to him, and they both grinned. The room shifted. You could feel it. Some of the townsfolk looked away, ashamed for her. Some of them pitied her, which is its own kind of unkindness. And nobody, not one grown man or woman in all those folding chairs, stood up to say a word for Alma Rourke. Nobody, that is, but a voice from the very back. Junie Dahl, 17 years old. She pumped gas at the filling station on the county road, and she'd been filling Alma's tank on credit for 2 years and never once made her feel small about it. Junie stood halfway up out of her chair, red in the face, and she said, "That's not right, Mr. Prewitt. You oughtn't talk to her like that." Prewitt didn't even look back. He waved the girl off like a fly. The commission chairman rapped his little gavel and said, "Order, order," and Junie sat back down, shaking, and the moment passed over her like water over a stone. Then Alma Rourke stood up. The room went still. She wasn't much to look at, standing, a small woman, gray-headed, her back a little bent. She turned, not to the commissioners, but to Prewitt himself. and she looked at him with a steadiness that ought to have warned him, if he'd had the wit to read it. "The land was here before your road, Mr. Prewitt," she said. Quiet, just that. And then she sat back down. That was all. No threat. No plea. She didn't tell them what she was. She didn't reach for the drawer full of gray paper 40 feet away in the deed room. She just said the one true thing, and folded her hands, and let them think whatever they wanted. And what they thought was that she'd lost. You could see it on every face. The old woman had had her say, her small, brave, useless say, and now the road would roll right over her. Prewitt smiled. Carl Meach smirked. The commissioners moved on to the next item like the matter was closed. If you'd been in that room, your heart would have sunk. She looked beaten. She looked like every good, small, poor person who ever stood up to a rich man and got flattened for the trouble. That was the low point. That was the hour when Alma Rourke looked most alone. But watch what she did next. Because it wasn't what a beaten woman does. She drove home, 4 miles of gravel in the failing light. She fed her stove and warmed her supper and ate it at the kitchen table with the radio low. And when she'd washed her 1 plate and 1 fork and set them in the rack, she went to the cupboard by the window and took down a box. A tin box, dented on one corner where it had fallen off a wagon in 1949. A title box, the kind a careful man kept his important papers in. Silas's box. She set it on the table under the light, and she worked the little latch, and she opened it. Now the town didn't see this. The commissioners didn't see it. And Prewitt didn't. And Carl Meach didn't. But you and I, we get to lean over her shoulder in that quiet kitchen and look down into the tin box. And here is what was in it. Deeds, a stack of them, soft at the folds from being handled over the years. And Alma laid them out on the oilcloth, one at a time, the way you'd deal a slow hand of cards. The first 2 she set side by side. 2 parcels, and if you knew the county, you'd have gone cold looking at them. Because these 2 lots sat on either side of her home place, one to the north, one to the south. The 2 pieces of ground the interchange had to cross to reach her at all. The land the on-ramps would have to run over to tie the new road into the old. Prewitt's whole 12 miles came to nothing if he couldn't cross those 2 lots. And those 2 lots belonged to Coldwater Land and Title Company. Which was to say, they belonged to the small, gray-headed woman sitting alone at a kitchen table 4 miles out of town. She set down a 3rd paper. A ground lease. For a building in Harlan Springs. 114 Commerce Street. Alma didn't need to read the address twice. She knew it. Everybody knew it. It was Gordon Prewitt's own office. The land under his desk, under his big chair, under the very floor where he'd signed the petition to take her home, was Coldwater ground. He rented the dirt he stood on, and never once thought to look up who he paid. And she set down a 4th paper. The last one. She held it a moment longer than the others, and then she laid it flat and smoothed it with her palm. A promissory note. A big one, the kind of paper that sits underneath a bank the way a foundation sits under a house. She didn't gasp. She didn't smile. She didn't get up and make a telephone call, though there was a telephone on the wall not 6 feet away. She just looked at the 4 papers laid out under the light, and she thought her own thoughts, and after a while she gathered them up, squared the edges, and set them back in the tin box. She closed the latch. Then she went to bed. Because she was 74 years old, and it was late, and her tomatoes would want water in the morning whether the world was upside down or not. She told no one. That is the part I want you to hold. She had, sitting in a dented box on her kitchen table, everything she needed to break Gordon Prewitt like a dry stick across her knee. And she went to bed and slept. Meanwhile, in town, a small thing happened that the town also failed to notice. A clerk down at the courthouse was pulling files for the condemnation, gathering up the paperwork the way clerks do. He hauled out a drawer, and he ran his finger down the tabs, and he muttered, half to himself and half to the fellow at the next desk, "Lord, Coldwater again. This outfit owns half the North Townships. Who are these people?" The fellow at the next desk shrugged and kept typing. "Who are these people?" He said it and let it go. Nobody chased it. The name Coldwater lay on the file like a stone at the bottom of a creek, and the water just ran over it. Same as always. A few evenings after that, Junie Doll came out to the home place in her daddy's pickup. She'd been fretting about the old woman since the commission meeting, chewing on it the way the young chew on unfairness, like it's a thing they personally have to fix. She found Alma on the porch in the dusk, shelling something into a bowl. Junie asked if she could drive her out to see it. The highway line. The place where they'd staked it. Alma looked at the girl a moment, and then she set down her bowl and said all right. She got her coat. They drove out to where the surveyors had been. And there it was, in the last of the light. Stakes in a long line marching across the fields, little ribbons of orange plastic tied to them, snapping in the evening wind. The path of the road laid out plain across the green. It ran right at the home place, right at the porch where they'd just been sitting. The two of them stood at the fence and looked at it. The girl was near tears. "It's really happening," Junie said. "They're really going to take it. Mrs. Rourke, it isn't right. It isn't right, and nobody's going to stop it." Alma looked at the stakes a long time. She wasn't angry. That's what Junie couldn't understand. The old woman just stood there calm as a pond, watching those orange ribbons snap in the wind, like a person watching weather come in from a long way off, deciding whether it was worth going inside for. Then Junie said the thing. She turned to Alma and she said, "Why don't you just tell 'em? Why don't you just tell 'em who you are? Make 'em stop. You could make 'em all stop if you just said it." And Alma Rourke smiled a small smile at the darkening field. And she said, "A person who has to say it never really is it." Junie didn't understand that. Not then. She'd understand it later, and she'd carry it the rest of her life. But that night it just sat between them, strange and quiet, while the wind moved the ribbons on the stakes. They drove back. Alma thanked the girl and went in and lit her lamp. And now we come to the morning that the whole thing turned on. The quietest, smallest morning in this whole story. If you'd been standing in the recorder's office that day, you'd have seen nothing at all. An old woman come to do a little paperwork. That's all it looked like. That's all it was ever meant to look like. Alma drove into Harlan Springs. She parked the Ford down where the pavement went bad, because she'd learned her lesson about the striped spaces, and she didn't mind the walk. She went up the steps of the county building and inside, to the recorder's counter, where Del Hutchins stood in his shirt sleeves with ink on his fingers. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. She told Del two things, plain as ordering at a lunch counter. First, the ground lease on 114 Commerce Street was coming up for renewal in a few weeks' time. She instructed him not to renew it. Let it lapse. Let it run out its string and expire, and file it so. Second, for the condemnation record, the one the county was building for the hearing, she wanted the current. Certified owners of the two parcels flanking her home place put down official. The two lots the on-ramps had to cross. She wanted it on the record, in black ink, exactly who owned them. No more, no less. Just the truth, certified and filed, waiting in the county's own papers for anybody with the wit to read it. Del Hutchins looked at her, and something passed between the two of them, some understanding that had been 40 years in the making. He didn't ask her why. He knew why. He took up his pen, and he made the entries, and Alma Rourke signed her small, careful name one time. One signature. That was the whole of it. No lawyers, no threats, no telephone call. Though the telephone was right there on the wall, and one call would have ended it that very hour. She held that call back. She kept it in her pocket like a match she wasn't ready to strike. She just signed the paper, and thanked Del, and walked back out into the spring morning. Then she drove home and watered her tomatoes. That's what she did. She just set in motion the thing that would take everything Gordon Prewitt had, and she went home and knelt in her garden with a tin watering can and gave her plants their drink, working down the row, patient, her mended coat riding up on her thin shoulders. The road hummed with distant machinery a mile off. She didn't look up at it. Because here is what Gordon Prewitt didn't know. That spring morning, as he sat in his office at 114 Commerce Street, on ground he no longer had the right to keep. He didn't know the woman he'd called a weed had just, with one quiet signature, closed her hand around the 2 lots his road couldn't cross, and the floor beneath his own chair, and the note beneath his bank. He didn't know the clock he'd set to strike in his favor was going to strike in hers. He didn't know any of it. He was, at that very moment, planning a celebration. And what a celebration he planned. Gordon Prewitt didn't do things small. He booked the groundbreaking for the interchange itself, right out on the staked field where the on-ramps would one day curve. He set the date for the same morning as the condemnation hearing. He liked that. He liked the neatness of it. Take the old woman's quarter-acre in the courthouse before lunch, then drive out and put a chrome shovel in the ground before supper. A clean day. A winter's day. He had the shovel ordered special. Chrome, with a walnut handle. He showed it to Carl Meach in the office, and Carl said it was a beauty. Because Carl said whatever Gordon wanted to hear. That was the week Prewitt leaned harder on the bank. See, a bond is a promise, and a promise costs money to keep. Prewitt had promised a 12-mile expressway. The financing came due the same day as everything else, and to hold it all together, he needed more. So he went to First Cattleman's Bank, and he sat across the desk from Raymond Fisk, and he borrowed against the very bond that was going to make him rich. Money on top of money. A man building a tower and pulling the bottom bricks to build it higher. Fisk didn't love it. But Prewitt was the biggest thing to happen to Delrose County in 40 years, and a bank president doesn't say no to the future. So he signed. Now here's where it starts to turn, and I want you to watch it close, because it's quiet, the way the real things always are. There was a luncheon at the bank. One of those dull affairs, cold chicken and warm punch, the county's careful men in their careful suits. Raymond Fisk stood to say a few words about progress. And before he spoke, a clerk handed him a folder. Routine, certified owner notices, the kind the recorder's office files when land changes hands or gets pinned down for a public taking. Fisk opened it while he was still smiling. His eye caught on a name. Coldwater Land and Title Company. He read the line under it, the 2 parcels flanking the interchange. Owner of record, certified, filed by Del Hutchins himself, in black ink. In the county's own book. Raymond Fisk went pale. Right there at the head table, mid-sentence, the color drained out of his face like water out of a cracked jug. Because Fisk knew that name. Fisk knew a thing about Coldwater that nobody in that room knew, and it had just walked up and sat down beside his bank. But Gordon Prewitt wasn't at that luncheon. Gordon Prewitt was too busy. And that's the whole tragedy of a man like him. The one thing that could save you goes sailing right past, and you never look up, because you're already spending money you don't have. There was one more moment that week. One near miss. I have to tell you about it, because it's how close the truth came to spilling early, and how it held. Carl Meach was down at the county building, filing Prewitt's papers, feeling important, and he heard a clerk say that name again. Coldwater, Owns half the North Townships, the clerk said, shaking his head. Carl's ears pricked up. He walked to the deed room. He got within 40 feet of the drawer. Coldwater's whole story sat in that drawer, waiting for any man with the wit to pull it. Carl put his hand out, and the telephone rang for him. Prewitt wanted him back at the office. Right now. So Carl turned around and left. He never touched the drawer. The truth stayed folded in the dark, patient, exactly where Alma had left it. Out at the home place, Alma Rourke was doing her canning. She had the tin box on the kitchen table again. Second time you've seen it open. She lifted the unrenewed lease out from where Dell had given her the copy, the ground lease on 114 Commerce Street, the paper that said Gordon Prewitt sat on floor that wasn't his. She read it once, slow, then she folded it, and laid it back in the box, on top of the deeds, next to the big promissory note. She closed the dented lid. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and went back to her tomatoes. Now, the county started to move like a thing that had already decided. The paper ran at front page. Progress comes to Delrose. There was a photograph of Prewitt with his chrome shovel, grinning under the headline. They staged the bulldozers at the county line, 4 miles out, yellow and enormous. Waiting on the word. They planted the orange survey stakes thick through the fields, the plastic ribbons snapping in the spring wind, marking the road that was going to run straight over Alma Rourke's porch. Everybody knew how it would end. The old woman would lose. The road would come. That's how it always went. The big man wins and the small one moves. Junie Dahl couldn't stand it. Junie was 17. She pumped gas at the filling station in Harlan Springs, and she'd been filling Alma's tank on credit for 2 years, and never once made her feel small about it. Junie had been the only voice in that whole commission meeting to speak up for Alma, hollered it from the back row while the grown men laughed. Now she drove out to the home place, and she found Alma on the porch, rocking, calm as a Sunday. "They've got the bulldozers set," Junie said. "Out at the line. I saw them. Alma, they're really going to do it." Alma nodded. She kept rocking. "Why aren't you scared?" Junie's voice cracked on it. "Why aren't you doing something?" And Alma looked out at the fields, at the orange stakes marching toward her house, and she said, "I did do something, honey, a while back. Sometimes doing something looks a lot like sitting still." Junie didn't understand it. She was 17, and the world still looked to her like it was made of noise, and she couldn't yet hear the thing that moves under the quiet. But she sat down on the step beside the old woman, and the two of them watched the sun go down behind the stakes, and Alma reached over and patted her hand. "Come to the groundbreaking," Alma said. "Wear something nice." And then it was the morning. They set up the folding chairs right out on the staked field, in 2 neat rows, on the exact ground where the on-ramps would cross. The press came, a man from the county paper and a fellow with a big boxy camera. The commissioners came, every last one of them, the same men who'd sat in that meeting and let Alma be mocked and said not a word. The hardhats came, 11 of them, the same 11 who'd laughed on the county building steps. Everybody who'd watched her wound was there to watch her win. Prewitt had made sure of it. He wanted an audience. He stood in the center with his chrome shovel, walnut handle gleaming. Carl Meach stood at his shoulder, smirking already, warming up his snicker. The chairman of the commission gave a little speech about the future. And then he called Gordon Prewitt forward to turn the first ceremonial spade of earth on the great Delrose expressway. Prewitt stepped up. He put his fine shoe on the chrome edge. He smiled for the camera. And Del Hutchins walked out of the crowd. He came slow, the county recorder, a quiet gray man in a plain coat, and he carried a leather folder under his arm. He walked right up to the staked ground, and he stopped. And he said, in a voice that didn't need to be loud, because the whole field had gone still to hear it, "Mr. Prewitt, before you dig, I've got the certified plats here, and there's a problem with your ground." Prewitt laughed. "Del, whatever it is, file it Monday. We're breaking ground." "You can't break this ground," Del said. "Not here. These two parcels, the north one and the south one, the exact ground your on-ramps have to cross, they're not the county's to take. They never were. They belong to Coldwater Land and Title Company. And Coldwater's land can't be condemned without the owner's consent." A murmur went through the folding chairs. The commissioners looked at each other. Prewitt's smile held, but it went stiff at the corners. "Coldwater," he said. "Never heard of them. Fine, then I'll buy the outfit out. Every man's got a price. Where do I find whoever runs this Coldwater?" And Del Hutchins looked at him. And then he turned his head, slow, and he looked toward the second row of folding chairs. "You'll have to ask the owner," Del said. "She's standing right there." Every head in that field turned. And there was Alma Rourke, 74 years old, in the same patched coat 2 winters past mending, her hands folded in front of her, standing quiet at the edge of the staked ground she owned on 3 sides. Carl Meach's face went first. You should have seen it. The smirk fell off him like a shingle off a roof. His mouth came open, and no sound came out of it. He looked at Alma, and he looked at Prewitt, and he looked back at Alma, and the whole thing he thought he knew about the world came apart behind his eyes right there in front of everybody. He'd parroted every joke. He'd snickered on cue. And now he stood there with his mouth open and nothing to say, the first face in the county to understand. The chairman half rose out of his folding chair. "Is this, Prewitt? Is this true?" But Prewitt wasn't laughing now. He was staring at the old woman. "You," he said. "You're a farm widow. You drive a rusted-out truck. You couldn't make the offer on your own lot. $3,850, and you couldn't take it." "I didn't want it," Alma said. "Quiet. There's a difference. This is a bluff." Prewitt's voice climbed. He turned to the crowd, to the cameras, spreading his hands. "This is some trick. Some old woman playing a trick. I'll have my lawyers on this Coldwater by Gordon." That was Raymond Fisk. The bank president had come out of the chairs, and his face was the color of ash, and he was holding the folder from the luncheon in both hands like it might get away from him. The whole field looked at him. Prewitt looked at him. "Gordon," Fisk said again, and his voice was terrible and small. "It's not a bluff. I've known for a week. I couldn't figure how to tell you." He swallowed. "Coldwater Land and Title owns more than these 2 parcels." "What are you talking about?" "The ground under your office." Fisk's hands shook. 114 Commerce Street. "You don't own that floor, Gordon. You never did. You lease the ground. And the ground belongs to Coldwater." He looked at the folder. He looked up. The lease lapsed 9 days ago. It wasn't renewed. You've been running your company off a floor you don't have a right to stand on. There was no sound in that field but the wind snapping the plastic ribbons on the stakes. Prewitt's shovel had drifted down. The chrome tip was resting in the dirt now, not cutting it. The color was going out of him the way it had gone out of Fisk at the luncheon, draining down from his forehead, layer by layer, as each thing landed. That's 2 things, Prewitt said. His voice had lost its bottom. 2 lots and a lease. I can work around 2 lots and a lease. I can reroute. There's a 3rd thing. Fisk said it like a man confessing at a funeral. His own board had made him come. His own board had told him he had no choice but to say the last of it, out loud, in front of the county and the cameras. The note, Gordon, Fisk's voice broke on it. The note that underwrites your highway bond. The paper that holds up everything you've borrowed, everything you've leveraged, the whole tower of it. He shut his eyes. It's held by Coldwater. It's held by her. 1 telephone call from that woman, and your financing is gone. Not delayed. Gone, called in. The bond collapses, and everything you've got collapses with it. And Gordon Prewitt turned, slow, to look at the old woman in the patched coat. She'd had that telephone call in her pocket the whole time, since the very first morning at the recorder's counter. She'd held it back like a match she wasn't ready to strike. One call that could have ended him in an hour, and she'd never made it. She'd just let him build. Let him borrow. Let him order his chrome shovel and stage his bulldozers and print his headline. And all the while the ground and the floor and the note sat quiet in a dented tin box on her kitchen table. He looked at her, and for the first time in his life, Gordon Prewitt didn't have a thing to say. Alma Rourke stepped forward. She came up onto the staked ground, small and slow, and she stopped in front of him, and the whole field, every hardhat and every commissioner and every man who'd laughed at her on the county building steps, leaned in to hear. She didn't raise her voice. She never once raised her voice. "You built your whole road across my county, Mr. Prewitt," she said. "You only forgot to ask who owned the ground under your feet." That was all. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't have to. She'd told him twice already the land was here before your road, and he'd waved her patched coat at a laughing room and called her the last stubborn weed in the road of progress. The truth had done the rest. She'd never had to lift her hand. She'd only had to wait and water her tomatoes and let a proud man climb all the way to the top of a ladder he'd propped against her house. She turned to Hutchins. And she reached into the crook of her arm, and she brought out the tin box. Third time you've seen it. Dented on one corner, the corner it got when it fell off a wagon back in 1949. 23 years of kitchen cupboards and quiet keeping. She put it in Dell's hands. "File them," she said. "All of it. Let it be on the record, in black ink, exactly who owns what. No more, no less. Just the truth." And Hutchins, county recorder of Delrose, took off his hat to her one more time, in front of the whole staring county, and took the box. Prewitt's chrome shovel lay in the dirt where he dropped it. Nobody ever did break ground that morning. 6 months on, it was autumn. The leaves had turned along the fence lines out at the home place, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cut hay. There was a new road out there. They did build the expressway. But they built it on the alignment Alma allowed, and she made them curve it. It bent around the home place in a long, easy arc, the way a river bends around a stone it can't move, and the on-ramps crossed the two flanking parcels on her lease terms, in her time, by her leave. The money that would have gone into Prewitt's pocket went somewhere else. Alma saw to that too. She set it into a county fund, a farm relief fund, for the families around Delrose who came up short in a hard winter and had nowhere to turn. She put Silas's name on it. Silas Rourke, who'd spent 40 years buying the land nobody wanted, at her side, under a plain company name. Never spending, never bragging. Both of them driving old trucks and wearing old coats. 3 years he'd been gone. Now his name was on the thing that would help his neighbors long after everyone forgot who Gordon Prewitt was. Alma sat on her porch in the long autumn light and rocked. The new road hummed, faint, a half-mile off, a soft, steady sound like a faraway river. Her tomatoes were all canned and put up, rows of red jars glowing on the cellar shelves. She'd had a good year. Inside, at the kitchen table, Junie Doll sat doing her homework. She came out most evenings now. Alma helped her with her figures, and Junie helped Alma with the heavy lifting, and neither one ever called it what it was, which was two lonely people who'd found each other and decided to stay. And the others? Well, Gordon Prewitt sold the office he no longer owned the ground beneath. For whatever a man can get for a building he can't keep, and he left Delrose County, and nobody there heard his name again. And Carl Meach, the young man who'd snickered on cue and parroted every joke, He took a job down at the filling station in Harlan Springs, pumping gas. Junie trained him. She showed him how to work the pump and count the change. And if she was ever tempted to say a word about it, she never did, because she'd learned kindness from the best there was. Here's the thing about the quiet ones. Here's what a man like Prewitt never can understand, right up until the ground goes out from under him. The quiet ones aren't quiet because they're weak. They're quiet because they never needed you to know. Alma Rourke owned half the North Townships of that county, and she'd have gone to her grave in a patched coat and let the whole world call her a weed, and never said a word if a proud man hadn't laughed at her on a set of courthouse steps and dared the wrong old woman to move her truck. She just wanted her porch. That's all she ever wanted. And in the end, she got it. And she got the road on her own terms. And she got a girl at her kitchen table and her husband's name on a good thing. And the last stubborn weed in the road of progress bloomed right there, where she'd always stood. So if you've been underestimated by somebody who should have looked closer, if you've ever moved your truck and said not a word, you remember Alma Rourke. And do me one kindness. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Alma's story travels. There are things that get remembered in a small county, and things that get forgotten, and it is almost never the things you'd expect. The groundbreaking ceremony photographs ran once in the Delrose County and were filed in a drawer somewhere, and nobody pulled them out again. What got remembered was smaller. Del Hutchins, for the rest of his working life, kept a framed survey plat on the wall behind his counter, the interchange alignment, as it was finally built. Curving 37 degrees north of the original line to spare the home place, and when a young deputy or a new clerk would ask about it, he'd say only, that curve cost a developer everything he had and didn't cost that old woman a nickel. And then he'd go back to his filing. The road itself was something. Alma watched them build it from her porch through that whole summer, the second summer. The one after everything had settled. She watched the machines work the far field, and she thought about Silas, who had bought that field from a man named Dory Coburn in 1951 for back taxes and a handshake, and she thought he would have found the whole business quietly funny in the way he found most things quietly funny, which was with his eyes and never his mouth. She missed him the way you miss a hand you've had your whole life. Not with pain anymore, mostly, just with the noticing of absence, the way you reach for something in the dark and find it gone, and you think, oh yes, I know. I remember. The tomatoes did well that year. Better than they had in 3 or 4 years, actually, which Alma took as a sign of something, though she could not have said what. She put up 42 jars before the first frost and lined them on the shelf in the back room and stood looking at them for a long time. Red as anything. Silas had always said a good tomato year meant the ground was right, and she supposed the ground was as right as it had ever been. Junie came by most evenings after the filling station closed, and they had a routine. Alma would have coffee made, and Junie would do her schoolwork at the kitchen table while Alma read or mended or simply sat, and very little was said, and it was the best kind of company, the kind that doesn't need to fill the air to prove it's there. Junie was saving money. She had it written in a small ledger she kept in her coat pocket, every dollar earned and every dollar set aside, and sometimes she'd show Alma the numbers, and Alma would look at them and nod and say, "That's good, Junie. That's exactly right." She was going to Columbus for school the following autumn. Alma had known this before Junie did, had seen it in the way the girl held a book, like it was something she was afraid might be taken from her. The Farm Relief Fund went into administration in October, chartered through the County Agricultural Office with the proceeds of the cold water lease agreements on the 2 interchange parcels. They named it the Silas Rourke Agricultural Relief Fund, and the first year it helped 14 families with back equipment notes and seed costs. And Alma went to the small ceremony they held for it in the county building's meeting room, The same room where the commission had let a man wave her patched coat at her and call her a weed, and she sat in the back row and accepted the thanks that were offered, and said the thing she always said, which was that Silas had done the work, and she was only tidying up after him. And nobody in that room believed that entirely, but they let her have it, because some people earn the right to be modest on their own terms. She never spoke publicly about what had happened. Not once, not directly. There were people who asked her, particularly in the months right after, reporters from the Courier and once a woman from a Columbus paper, who drove all the way out and knocked on the door, and Alma made her a cup of coffee and answered every question about the weather and the tomatoes and the new road's noise level and sent her back down the drive with nothing she could print. There was nothing to say that the facts hadn't already said. A man had looked at her and seen nothing worth knowing. He had been wrong about that. The rest was just paperwork. What she thought about, sitting on the porch on the cold evenings when the new road hummed its distant hum and the light went low over the fields, was not Prewitt at all. She thought about Silas, and about the long patient years of buying what nobody wanted, and about how the two of them had never once talked about it as a strategy or a plan or anything so intentional as that. They had simply looked at the county they lived in and thought, this is where we are, and we might as well hold a piece of it. And they had done that. Quietly, the way you do things when you don't need anyone to watch you do them. She thought the road was fine. Actually, she'd thought so from the beginning. Progress was fine. Roads were fine. What a man like Prewitt could never understand was that she had not been against the road. She had been against being handled. She had been against being waved off a striped parking space like a stray and told what her last piece of ground was worth by a man who had not thought to look at who he was talking to. That was what she had refused. Not the road. The condescension. The new alignment was a little longer, that curve adding perhaps a half-mile to the full expressway run. The engineers had noted this in their revised submission, and the commission had approved it anyway, and Alma had signed the lease agreements for the on-ramp crossings without theater of any kind, at Del's counter, in the plain way she had always done business. And she'd driven the old Ford home and made supper. The tin box stayed in the recorder's office now, filed properly. The way it should have been all along. She'd kept it on the kitchen table long enough. It had done its work. On the porch, in the last of the autumn light, with the new road a low sound under the wind and the fields going brown and Junie's light burning in the kitchen window behind her, Alma Rourke pulled her coat a little closer. A new coat. Junie had given it to her, insisted until she'd accepted, and she listened to the county settle into itself around her. And she thought that Silas would have liked this evening very much, and she thought he had known, even at the end, that she would be all right. She had been all right. The wind came off the north field, the way it always had, carrying the particular smell of turned earth and dried grass and something faintly mineral underneath. The smell of the county itself, deep and old and indifferent to anything any one person wanted from it. She had grown up breathing that smell. She had stopped noticing it for long stretches of her life and then noticed it again. The way you notice a sound only once it has been there long enough to become background and then shifts just slightly, just enough to remind you it was always there. The porch boards were cold through her shoes. The new coat was heavier than her old one, lined properly, the kind of weight that settled around the shoulders and stayed. Junie had good sense about practical things. She always had. Across the fields, the lights from the new interchange were visible now most evenings, a low amber blush above the tree line to the east, softer than she had expected it to be, softer than the drawings had suggested. The county looked lit from inside that direction, the way it used to look during harvest when the combines ran late and their headlights swept slow arcs through the dust. Different light, same distance. She did not mind it. She had decided she did not mind it some weeks ago, and had not changed her mind since. What she felt, sitting with her hands loose in her lap and the coat doing its quiet work against the cold, was something close to ordinary. Not triumphant. Not at peace in the way people described peace, as if it were a reward you finally unwrapped. Just ordinary. The fields were the fields. The evening was the evening. The road was the road. She was here, and she had been here a long time, and she intended to be here a while longer, and that was enough. That had always been enough. She just had not always known how to say so.